It's the same question that David Lee asked from our Patreon group. Shout out to our patrons. If I'm an indie artist, how do I start getting involved in this world? What do I even start with, you know?
Yeah, so I think there's this notion that NFTs are really scary. In principle, it's basically just uploading a file to the blockchain. It's no different than uploading like a YouTube video or a post on Instagram or anything like that. It's just using a different mechanism to do that. And so I mentioned earlier a protocol called Zora. One of the best pieces of that is that it's permissionless in the sense that anyone who has an invite can go ahead and upload to that platform. So there's a couple of these different marketplaces that are completely permissionless, which means you don't need an invite. You can go and do it at your own free whim. So Mark Cuban uploaded his first NFT to a platform called Rarible. And that's one where you can just go in and do it yourself. You don't need anyone to give you permission. You can upload whatever you want. And what I'd say to indie artists is, create an NFT or basically a file around a piece of content that you're really excited about. So whether it's your next album, it's your next single, et cetera, and build in NFTs into that marketing strategy. So it's less about using it as a sale mechanism. It's more about showing that you're ahead of the curve in terms of technology, and sort of use one of these platforms to be like, hey, I'm poking around with NFTs. More times than not, you'll find that NFT collectors are really just willing to lean into like new usage of the technology. And so a lot of these smaller artists that don't have huge Spotify followings are signing up for these platforms, doing really creative drops and seeing sales in like the thousands of dollars for a piece of content that, is basically equivalent to like 1 million streams, but happens over such a short period of time that it's a really fun frontier to play around in.
Wait, so can we kind of double down there? So let's say someone releases a song or a piece of art or artwork with an NFT and it starts selling for thousands of dollars. What is the incentive for the people that don't necessarily know the artist or the music or even like the piece of art that much at that point? Like how is it kind of shooting off like it is in these smaller communities like that?
I think it's patronage. I think that for a lot of these NFT collectors, they like to see people embracing new technology and they're willing to support creatives that are pursuing their career, in a new and exciting way. And so I think that there is obviously an expectation that this artist will do better in the future. And so by collecting them early as they sort of grow their career, that piece will be worth more. But for some of these smaller acts, there's a community of musician NFT collectors that are bidding on each other's works, that are showing support and signal. And I think that, the expectation or incentive is more just about the space as a whole growing, right? And sort of proving that people are willing to commit to the value of this digital content. And in turn, over the long term, I think we'll see better use cases emerge where that value is very clear. And so they can kind of be rewarded for being a really early adopter of that.
Right. So it's not just an investment in the artist, it's an investment in the space in general.
Absolutely.
When you think through the timeline of adoption, what do you feel are because I think this even came up in our conversation prior. I think right now it's this is still very much in an early adopter phase where it's unless you as an artist are very authentically interested in the space of NFTs or you have a good audience kind of crossover where your audience might be interested, this might just feel there's a good chance that this is just going to blow past a lot of your fans that might not either get it or might not want it. Not to say that's not going to come in due time, but as you think about us getting to that point in time, what do you feel are going to be some of the major inflection points? What do you think needs to happen? And how long, give or take, do you see this really taking?
Yeah, I'd say about a year or two until we're seeing consumer grade NFTs. Right now, it's very hobbyist in nature. A lot of these NFTs are really high tier where you need to have a high amount to spend to be able to participate. I mentioned earlier, $500 to $1,000 is the base price for a lot of these kind of custom NFTs. I think that's going to be the case for a while longer. To the point about what we need to get there, I think that platforms like Nifty Gateway that allow users to buy with a credit card is a really great example of that. One of the biggest blockers to NFT today is that most platforms need to have MetaMask and Ether to be able to transact. And while that's something that I do every day, I recognize it's by no means standard at this point. And so artists being cognizant that when they're doing these NFT drops, they're marketing to an entirely new audience of crypto native users, and leaning into marketing around those users and trying to get in those collector circles is actually far more powerful than expecting your fans on Instagram to come and collect your NFTs, because realistically, that's just not going to happen for at least another year or two until the platforms are built out that support those interactions.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And alleviates friction from these kind of people that are just trying to tip their toes in the water. When you think about the different like marketplaces, you mentioned Nifty Gateway, Super Rare. Can you talk a little bit further about like what kind of the landscape looks like as it stands with regards to marketplaces, maybe pros and cons of each, and who you think will continue to really grow and become the kind of the leader?
Yeah, for sure. So Nifty Gateway is leading with the most sales volume right now. Like I said, it's because they have credit card purchases. They're doing these Supreme Child drops that are really attractive to collectors. Super Rare is a one-of-one marketplace, which means that every piece on Super Rare is released as a one-of-one edition. And that's contrary to something like Nifty Gateway, where you have multiple editions of a piece. You have packs, you have silent auctions, you kind of have all these different mechanics. Super Rare really leans on curation. So it's very difficult to get on that platform. But once you do, it's kind of like a status symbol that you're like, hey, I'm a badass NFT artist. I got accepted into Super Rare. There's a new platform called Foundation that just launched that's very similar to Super Rare in the fact that it's highly curated. They're really leaning on user experience and sort of optimizing for that like aha moment or that confetti moment when you collect. And so if you go to Foundation, you'll notice there's a very specific style around 3D art, generative art, render art, et cetera, et cetera. And then, like I mentioned, Zora, so an open protocol to create NFTs and sort of redefining the way that that asset is created and issued on the blockchain. There's honestly over like 50 issuers at this point to make NFTs, and it's really just a matter of preference around style, curation, what type of currency you want to pay in, and kind of figuring out like which artists you really align and where they're releasing their work on.
So, sorry, Sam, I had one question specifically about that. So specifically, I mean, we've seen different distributors, for example, because this is kind of how I'm thinking of it in my head with these platforms. We've seen different distributors charge different prices. And you said a little bit earlier, like, DistroKid will charge just to put it up. And then you got STEM that charges 5% of whatever is streamed. And you said a little bit earlier, most places just take a cut of the first sale and then not again. Does that differ between these platforms at all? Or is that part of the pitch on some of these platforms that they actually charge differently? Has that begun to differentiate yet? Or is that kind of like the baseline standard across all of these platforms?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the baseline standard is taking some level of fee on the primary sale. That amount definitely varies by the marketplace. Some other marketplaces are starting to do like add-on fees. So for example, if I want to spend $100 on an NFT, they'll charge $30 on top of that, or $3, excuse me, for 3%. And so even if it's a secondary sale, every time there's a transaction, these platforms are capturing some value. But I'd say to your earlier question, yeah, it's kind of interesting because most artists aren't really talking about like the primary fee. It's more about sort of the collector base associated with the platform. And so to them, being able to get whitelisted and sort of released on these curated platforms is more important than the fee that's getting taken. I do expect over the long term, though, that I hope that fee goes close to zero. I think in the long term, all of these platforms will not be able to take fees for a service as simple as sort of like listing and surfacing an NFT. But for the short term, kind of given how new and exciting it is, I think it makes perfect sense that these platforms are charging a listing fee to be able to surface the best work possible.
So you think that instead of them potentially raising their prices over time, because there'll be more transactions, people will actually lower their prices?
Yeah, on the marketplace fee specifically. I think there's going to be other ways to capture value that's not extractive. And this is kind of what crypto is in general, right? Is removing intermediaries, removing transaction fees.
Right.
Over the long term, all of these systems are not going to charge transaction fees to perform a service. That value is going to be captured in the form of a token or in the form of some sort of ownership or equity that accrues value as these platforms get more valuable.